Okay, so I'm Nan Travers. I'm from the United States. I'm at the State University of New York's has 64 institutions. I'm at one of them called Empire State University. I run a center called the Center for Leadership and Credentialing Learning, as well as I'm a co-lead for a national project called Credential as You Go. Today, I'm not going to be talking about incremental credentialing, and I'm not specifically talking about prior learning assessment, which is what most people have heard me talk about for decades now. But I want to raise some issues that I'm seeing in our conversation and that I think are important. So these are much more theoretical concepts that I think we need to be thinking about. One is just what we mean by recognize and what the practice is around recognition. And in some ways, there are four ways that we can be looking at this. We have the recognition where we sort of say, I see you. And that would be a full recognition of what somebody knows and can do. There's the partial recognition, which we hear a lot about in higher education. What do we do if somebody has some of the some of the knowledge, but not all of the knowledge? How do we do this partial thing, which is a way of saying, I see a part of you, but we're still not recognizing the whole person. There's also misrecognition, which is where somebody actually has knowledge and skills, but we either see it as something different because of our own framing, our own mental model, or we say maybe there isn't something there because, again, of the way we're framing it. Or we could actually say, no, I'm not, there's no recognition here. We're not giving that. And what I would actually say is that there's really only one way to recognize. Many, many years ago, I heard a very wise Indigenous woman say that there is only one yes, and everything else is a shade of no. And so when we start to think about recognition, if we are not recognizing completely, we have that shade of no. And when Deb was just talking about some of the harm that can happen when we go through a recognition of prior learning process, some of that is that misrecognition, partial recognition, and non-recognition, which is really saying, no, you don't have knowledge. And so we do see through practice and through research, this has a big impact on people when you have somebody say, yeah, maybe, but not really. And some of the research in terms of, again, in higher education on persistence and completion, what it boils down to is that somebody feels like they belong. And so I think we have to be thinking about the messaging that we're giving people. So that gets us into this idea of a black box, which has also come up already in comment here, is that we kind of have this idea that somebody's going to go through a recognition process and out pops this recognition, which might be anything from the pat on the back to an actual award of like a formal award. But at the center of that is some form of assessment. Whether it is on the self-assessment side or the an external assessment side, there is some form of assessment. It's a judgment. Does somebody have this recognition or not? And when we start to look at assessment, one of the things that I've done is I've dived into the research around how does the brain learn. And when I summarize that down, we have kind of three main processes that are happening. We have a self-assessment that goes through. Whenever you're up against any kind of experience, you are checking out kind of like, is this something that I already know about? Is this something new? What do I have to do here? And so there's this natural self-assessment process. The next piece is inquiry, where you're seeking out to fill in the gaps. Do I need to expand my mental model? Do I need to adjust it? What do I need to add to it in order to make sense of the experience around you? And then how do I transfer that to the next piece? So that gets into kind of that inner circle in this diagram, is that the convergent learning, there's actually many slides that I use often to build up to this. But when we take prior learning and the immediate learning that's happening, it converges together. So we have convergent learning that's combining the past and the current, and that's it builds relationships across the neural networks. What's important there is our minds build relationships. And when we go to assess people, we tend, and this is kind of one of the things that I'm on a soapbox on, is that we tend to think in terms of like skills, as though they're not a connected network. And so our brain is putting together a connected network and getting prepared for the future. And so as we start to look at assessment, we have these conundrums that exist. And when we talk about the different types of assessments, we go from self-assessment, which again, as I just talked about with a brain being, that's the way we're geared to address any kind of experience. We have peer assessment, where we're, you're my peers, I'm your peers. We're having different kinds of assessment in terms of just listening to me, you're making judgments about what I'm saying. Organizational, thinking about it from that, and then external assessments. And also in part here, in the external assessments, we also have things like frameworks that people are using in order to kind of, this idea that it's objective because it's sitting outside of the individual. So we have these different continuums that we're constantly trying to balance and think through, one being this continuum of trust. And we tend to think the more external the assessment, the more we can trust it. Somehow it's more objective, and that somehow the individual's assessment is less valuable. And one of the things that I would argue is that isn't necessarily true, that we've made some assumptions here. There is a continuum of the ease to administer. And so in just this last conversation, what came up is that the AI might be able to help out and scale things like RPL, because one of the things that we're up against is that to do self-assessment and peer assessment, it's very human heavy. And so we have a tendency to move towards more external assessments because it's easier. And I've actually had, I work with a lot of different institutions across the United States on prior learning assessment, which is what we call it, or credit for prior learning. And what I hear a lot is, we're not going to do that portfolio stuff because it's too hard. It's got too many steps to it. We'll stick to things like, standardized exams because that's easier. So this is a tension that is in the whole idea of recognition in terms of how do we go through that assessment process. Now, the continuum of accuracy. An individual is more accurate in being able to self-assess what he or she knows than what an external person who is outside of that person's system ever would know. And so what we have to be thinking about is, are we going for ease? Are we going for accuracy? What are we actually trying to assess here? And that gets also into, what are we assessing in terms of, are we actually looking at individual knowledge? Are we looking at the collective knowledge? And I would propose you cannot separate those two apart. And I will kind of hit this a little bit more. So as we go through these I've generalized different recognition models, but the first one that's over here on your left is that we already have a set system, and we're seeing, does the person's knowledge and skills fit in that set system? So we're trying to fit it into something that already exists. A different kind of model, which is the one all the way over to the right, is where we have individual knowledge and we have the formal recognitions, and we're doing it as an additive piece, not trying to fit it into another a system that's already existing, but thinking about, how do you fit it in, or how do you add it on? And so we're really up against, what are our models that we're really trying to work with here? And we have this assumption that we have a cause and effect here, that we have individual knowledge and skills, and that's going to fit into and equal what is preconceived and on the collective. So when I talk about now with the collective, anytime we're talking about an organized system that we're trying to say, okay, this person fits into this system, that's collectively within that culture of that system is saying that that's what is acceptable. And so the thing is that we don't treat this as a two-way street. We treat it as a one-way. And so we're saying, does the individual fit within the collective? We often also don't define what the collective is. And so that is an issue that we come up against. And so we have this kind of valuing filter that is in our recognition. And these are the things that I feel that we've got to start talking about and really kind of lay out here. And so really what we're doing is we're saying, okay, this person has all of this knowledge that's coming through their life in all the different ways. And then we're going to keep putting these filters on it until we finally get to the point where we're going to have some kind of recognition at the end. And we've left off a lot of things that somebody knows and can do that may actually fit if you're looking at it from different perspectives, or it may fit outside of a well-defined environment. So what we end up here is that we're trying to take lived experience language and lived experiences and somehow translate that over into whatever our formal assessment process, or even if it's informal, but we're fitting it into something else than what the person has actually experienced. And as humans, we can only explain what we know and can do through a narrative. It's a story. We're storytellers. And so we have to be thinking about how do we take this lived experience and this story and start to break it apart and reform it into a different narrative that's new narrative is where we're going to recognize. So knowledge is not just an individual. An individual actually doesn't own knowledge. They have experiences and they interpret those experiences, and that's how they're building a knowledge network of their own, but it always fits within a context and a larger one. So if we think about the individual and the idea of a collective knowledge base and coming together. Now, I've heard faculty over and over and over again over the years talk about that doing something like a prior learning assessment portfolio process is the best professional development that they ever could experience because they learn new stuff from the students who are doing the work in the field. And so the question becomes, how do our assessments allow the knowledge of individuals to actually change and evolve the collective? So all experiences are embedded in the collective, but also those experiences become part of the collective. So there's some work that's been done back in 1955 on the nomenological network by Cronbach and Meehl, where they were looking at the difference between construct validity and content validity. And in this idea is that a construct has lots and lots of different ways that it's connected. And our brains are working the same way. So as we go through our experiences and we develop our knowledge and skills, we are developing a neural network that is much more of a construct, nomenological network in the way that we understand it. But as we start to say, we're going to recognize this little bit here, it's what we, whoever's doing the assessment is cherishing and saying, okay, either you fit in my little box or you don't belong. And that's the message we're giving. However, the truth is that there's lots of ways that this knowledge is connected. And so we have to be starting to think about how can we capture what this knowledge is, but where does it sit, not just that it fit in my box. And so when we think about the ways in which kind of the assessment process is right now, and we think about, you have somebody like an advisor or somebody who is asking questions of the individual. There might be some clarifying, and in that response, there's also this criteria, and there's some kind of validation, and then an award. However, this is so full of biases that we have to really stop and think about the kinds of questions that are being asked, the individual who is kind of guiding that process, the criteria, and the validation process. So what I'm proposing, which is also an AI solution, but in conjunction with it's an additive piece, is that if we had an AI interface that worked with both, let's say, an advisor or anyone who was working with an individual, or just the individual, so it could be self-assessment, peer assessment, etc., where there's these different kinds of questions that could be kind of brought about. Now, Doug showed us the tool that they're working on, asking these questions, and then it matched over to some frameworks. What I'm proposing is a little different than that. What I'm proposing is that this actually does a mapping, like a neurological mapping, and it gets added so that we have this additional, and it becomes like a mega map. And there's a way then to say, okay, this framework fits in this map, and this person's knowledge is overlapping, so that's where that can overlap. But that person might also represent new knowledge that hasn't even been captured yet and is still valid. Or if it's never going to match up, it could still be sitting out there. But this is a way of really coming at this from a couple ways. One is that everyone belongs. We're not saying that your knowledge does not exist because it doesn't fit in my cherished spot. What it is that this is your knowledge, this is where it sits, and you're adding to the bigger community knowledge. And then if you want to use frameworks or other kinds of a course or other kinds of things that you're saying, licensing requirement, that can be mapped on here as well and see where somebody falls. So that brings me to the conclusion, which is that we measure what we cherish, and we need to really examine what it is that we are cherishing in order to really kind of look at what our practices are and how they're taking us down the road. All right, any comments, thoughts? Any rotten tomatoes?
Kia ora, my name's Maxine, I'm from New Zealand. I just want to thank you for your presentation. One of the parts that we're trying to look at is Indigenous knowledge systems. And so when you talk about new learnings, we talk about new with a K at the beginning, because these intrinsic knowings of our Indigenous peoples exist in us, but the recognition of those in the system or outside often don't happen. Have you come across any learnings about that?
So yes, and some of the work with Indigenous folks have influenced a lot of my thinking here. And part of it was, it had to do, many, many decades ago, I had a student who wanted to do a portfolio on his leadership skills that he developed within the community. And that was bigger than himself. And it totally threw the university off because they didn't know how to handle it. And I'm saying, okay, we are creating these boxes, and if people aren't in the box, then the message we're giving is that you don't belong. And so we've got to come up with new ways of looking at this. And so thank you.
Thanks, Nan. I always love your presentations. They're great. What I really liked was what you're presenting is almost like fits in with the American pragmatist conception of truth being what's good in the way of belief. And also there's lots of different ways of understanding the world and different belief systems. But my question is around the mapping and whether you found a tool that allows you to do that visual mapping.
So I had been working on concept mapping with students to develop their portfolios and faculty for evaluating the portfolios for a long time. I ran into issues, and it's just some wonderful tools, okay? I ran into issues that I needed to teach the students how to use it and the faculty how to use it, even though we were getting better results, more, I think, better at depth and breadth and quality of what you're getting. So now with the AI, I've done a little bit of playing, teeny bit. I'm not an AI whiz, so you and I probably should talk. But what I've been able to do is with the visual tools to be able to do the concept mapping. And so the idea is working with language tools and the visual tools together.
Thanks very much.